If you're an American conservative, you know that the societal values we hold sacred are under attack. They are hanging in the balance. How can you protect those values? By staying informed. The Closing Argument will deliver news and supporting evidence you need to support and defend those values. Here's Paul Smith.
Good morning. This is Paul Smith, your host of The Closing Argument. In this podcast, we discuss some of the important but controversial legal, moral, and political issues that affect us and our families today. Some things that we discuss are not politically correct, but these discussions are needed to preserve our liberties, to establish the truth, and to let the world know that there are many people who challenge some of the views that are gaining acceptance in our schools, our media, and our government. Today, we're going to talk about the Biden administration and George Orwell's novel, 1984. This is being recorded in early June 2022. A few weeks ago, the Biden administration either put on the shelf or scrapped its plan to create a Disinformation Governance Board as a part of the Department of Homeland Security. When they announced this created a substantial uproar in the United States. Most people were appalled and very upset at such an attempt. Basically, this was George Orwell's thought police. The stated reason for the Biden administration to do this, to try to identify and stop disinformation, was their expressed not only concern, their stated belief that the greatest threat facing the United States is domestic terrorism. And when they define who that is, they would end up saying the right-wing white supremacists, and then they would proceed to try to label Donald Trump and those who support him as being this group that was threatening the safety and security and well-being of America. This has concerned many people. There was such rage at this Disinformation Board that the administration in mid-May scrapped the plan and put it on its shelf. Whether it's totally dead, we don't know. News commentators pointed out that this seemed to be comparable with what was going on in George Orwell's novel, 1984. I want to take some time and actually talk about that model. As you will see from our discussion, while George Orwell was criticizing this totalitarian socialist society that he described, it appears that Joe Biden and his administration are using the 1984 model as an ideal model and are attempting to embrace and employ many of the tactics used in 1984. 1984, this novel coined several phrases that are still used today. One of them is Big Brother, which was the leader of this society, thought police, and so forth. So let me first just tell you a little bit about George Orwell and 1984, and then let's just mention a dozen or so characteristics of the government that was depicted in that novel. George Orwell was born in 1903. He died in 1950. He had a number of writings. He was from England. Perhaps his two best known novels were Animal Farm, that was written in 1945, and then the novel 1984 that was written the year before he died in 1949. Animal Farm was a fun little novel that basically was written to comment on what happened in Russia in the Russian Revolution that occurred around 1917 and 1918, when the Tsar of Russia was overthrown, and that's when Lenin came to power and established his socialist government. So in Animal Farm, the animals took over after the revolution and ended up establishing a government that was about as bad as the one that they had replaced, and the animal and base attitudes and desires of the animals took over. And so rather than creating a better government, what resulted in Animal Farm was one that was about as bad as the one they had. 1984 deals with a socialist society, and of course, socialism. There are two or three models of it that were very predominant in the world in the early to mid 1900s. You had the Russian model, as we just discussed, and you had the Chinese model, and then you had what Orwell described as the Oceania model. That's the name he gave of this country that established his socialism. So in this type of socialism, there was thought police where people were not allowed. Well, they're allowed if they had bad thoughts, that is, thoughts that might be dangerous to the government. They were eventually found out and then corrected through torture and so forth. In this society, they had widespread what they called telescreens. Of course, television had just been invented when Orwell wrote his novel. So he had these telescreens throughout the country, and they would do two things. They would show you what Big Brother wanted you to see and hear, but they could also see what you were doing. They're kind of like a big Zoom meeting. People had them in their homes. At least the upper class, so to speak, had them. The poor people that they called the proles, of which the society was about 85% proles, they didn't necessarily have these. They were a poor people. And Orwell said, look, the poor people, they, unless somebody really does something to them, they really never uprise. They're just content with their poor situation. But so in this novel, the main character is Winston Smith, who works in the Ministry of Truth. And much like some of the government departments today, the Ministry of Truth is about falsehood. Just like they had a Ministry of Love that inflicted torture to get you to do what you wanted to do. So they have, but in the Ministry of Truth, that's where Winston Smith worked. And his job was to constantly be rewriting books and texts that talked about history, because in this society, Big Brother had to constantly revise history so that it would support what he was doing. And so there was a constant effort to republish books. Actually, they would take some books out of circulation. And so they constantly had to revise history, because they said, who knows the past controls the future, but who controls the future controls the past. And in doing this, they could influence the people. If the people were not aware of things that happened in the past that challenged the current state of things, then it would be easier to control them. And so 1984 was all about controlling people and using force to do it. The greatest crime actually talked about in 1984 is the thought crime, that you would think something that might be against the party or Big Brother. And so if you were found to have harbored ideas and thoughts or to have written them down, they would find you out, because they could find out everything. And then they would interrogate you and torture you and get you to eventually believe what they wanted you to believe, obey what they wanted you to do, and actually love what you wanted to do. The novel ends when, our main character, Winston, is just, he challenges things and doesn't like some things about the Big Brother. They find him out, they torture him, they put him through this torture, and eventually he comes around. I don't know if he actually comes around, but he says he does. He's totally submissive, and then they kill him. And by the way, that's what they would do if someone was attacking the government. They wouldn't kill him first. They would first convert him through this technique, so to speak, and so that he then says all sorts of good things about Big Brother, and then sometime after that he would be killed. And then so the book ends when a bullet enters Winston's head and he dies. Now, let me mention some of the similarities between 1984 and the Biden administration. First of all, the term Big Brother is kind of interesting. There is no named person who's the head of the government. It's just Big Brother. And in the Biden administration, we have never had a more perfect fit for Big Brother. Yes, Biden has a name, but almost all serious observers of Biden wonder who really is running things, because Biden seems to be an empty head in many things. And he just, and further, his election was not so much a referendum about him. People didn't like him so much. It was an anti-Trump election, and anybody but Trump basically would have won. So Biden is the perfect representation of Big Brother. The Disinformation Board that we talked about is comparable to the thought police. Then just some other things about Big Brother. Guns are banned and virtually impossible to find in this society. There is a perpetual war going on, two wars really. They have a perpetual war against the countries they call Eurasia or East Asia, which seem to represent China and Russia, Russia being East Asia, China being East Asia and Russia being Euro-Asia. And the war is not so much to conquer anything, but the society finds that being in war actually helps the government control the people. Also, another aspect of this type of continuing contention that is there with the Big Brother is the perpetual hatred of opposition. And in this society, they have a ritual every day, the hate moment, about 2 minutes every day, when on the screen they depict the individual Emmanuel Goldstein, who represents the people who are threatening the party. He's the bad guy. The people. So the broadcasts about 2 minutes every day say bad things about him, represent him in a bad way, and people hate him, and it's to rile hatred against him. There never has been a better fit for Emmanuel Goldstein than Donald Trump, a perfect fit. And so they also have hate week, but it's interesting what we see in the news, the perpetual hatred of Trump that we've seen now, for about 6 years, although it's died down a little bit after Biden was elected, is perfect for what the party would do in the Brotherhood. Another thing about this society, they specifically sought to turn children against their parents. They had a thought police, I've mentioned, but the thought police is just a small part of what they set up in their society. The children were needed to spy on the parents and make sure that the parents weren't going astray. And it was a great compliment if a child would turn his or her parent in for having said something. And it said in the book that one of the greatest concerns is, what if you happen to talk in your sleep? And so they had somebody that was arrested and had to be rectified and corrected for saying something in his speech that was negative of the government. Not only then were the children there to enforce laws, and the role of family was totally diminished. In fact, they were trying to eliminate even normal sexual intercourse. They wanted the children to be created by artificial insemination. And they did not want anyone to have a family love or person-to-person love that could compete with their love for the government.